Something different this week. We decided to collect a lot of questions we've been getting from readers, from listeners, from viewers, put them together and answer them on the podcast. So here we go. These are real questions, real readers, and I think we'll have some fun with it. So let's begin with Jeff in Madison, Wisconsin, a very important swing state and an important location for Democrats to turn out the vote. He asks, with so much misinformation out there, how can we increase trust in our election systems and outcomes? That is a great question because right now you are seeing a full-on onslaught from Republicans to already discredit the election results, already claim illegals are voting, already claiming that the fix is in. And in fact, what they're doing is trying to institute all kinds of changes to muck up the works. In Georgia, Fulton County has decided that they're going to hand count ballots. Does that make any sense? No, it's a recipe for chaos, for error, for delay. So there are nearly 200 lawsuits going on right now that Republicans have filed around the country, trying to in some way restrict or restrain the voting counters, the tabulators, in some ways make it harder to vote, in other ways to allow discretion to the vote counters to change the vote. So there is plenty to be concerned about. But I will say this. We have a decentralized voting system. So it is very hard to cheat on any kind of significant scale. It is also the case that the vast majority of voting officials are responsible adults and live in their communities, have to face the voters, so they're not inclined to risk, for example, going to jail by mucking around with the votes. And lastly, Congress passed a bill last year called the Electoral Count Reform Act. And what that did was it sped up the process for filing any kind of court challenges. So Republicans have a limited amount of time to make a fuss. It also set out a process for, in most states, governors to certify the results and send them in. So I think that combination of a decentralized system, of decent people, and of the reforms from the Electoral Count Act, plus the fact that many of the swing states now have Democratic governors, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, gives me hope that we will go through a very smooth election. Doesn't mean there won't be challenges, doesn't mean Trump won't be claiming he was robbed, but the election itself will go smoothly, and I'm very confident we'll have a definitive outcome. So let's move along to Christy in Alexandria, Virginia. She writes in, the election is 4 weeks away. What's the best way for Kamala to reach voters during the final stretch? Well, she has answered your question this week. She's going on widely popular TV, podcast, radio shows, because that's where the voters are. We're not going to, at this point, see many people switch sides. I was going to vote for Donald Trump, but then Kamala Harris told me about her housing plan, so I'm going to switch. That's probably not going to be the case for the vast amount of people who haven't decided finally who they're going to vote for. What Kamala Harris needs to do is make sure the vast number of people who occasionally vote know enough about her that they are inclined to turn out and to vote. So she's going on shows, for example, The View, which specializes in over 50-year-old women. And that's a demographic she definitely needs to attract. She's also going on Howard Stern. He has a viewership of 10 million people that dwarfs any program that Fox would have. And again, he gets people, largely male in that case, who may not be tuning in to any of the mainstream news broadcasts. So I think it's a rather brilliant strategy. The other thing that is going on is she actually has a ground game, a huge, detailed, well-organized get out the vote operation. It goes down to the county level, to the neighborhood level, to the block level. Trump does not have this because he hasn't been running a real campaign. He's been running a scam to collect money so he can pay his lawyers. So they don't have that turnout machine. They don't have an effective way of making sure every one of their people vote. So although they're close in the polls, when you see the results on election day, I would not be surprised if she squeezes out a percentage or two more than you might expect, purely because she's well organized. She's got a campaign. And let me say this, if you can't run a campaign with professionalism, with an attention to detail, you're probably not going to run a country that way. And I do think that the campaign is emblematic of these two individuals: liar, truth teller; chaos, organization. And you really don't need to see much beyond the campaign to know how they're going to run the country. So let's move on to Natalie in Los Angeles. She asked one of my favorite questions. There's so much focus on the president. What are must-win down-ballot races we should be putting energy into? Great question. The Senate is razor close. It's going to come down, I think, to 3 Senate seats. Most of the watch out close Senate seats that Democrats held, either the exact candidate or the party held, are frankly relatively comfortable. They're safe. Democrats have run great candidates and Republicans have run goofballs. But there are 3 races that are incredibly close, and they will determine the outcome of the Senate. And that is John Tester in Montana. That's Rick Scott, who's the incumbent in Florida. And that's the infamous Ted Cruz in Texas. If Democrats can win even one of them, and they win the presidency, they can at least have 50 plus the vice president. And you think about it, that makes all the difference in the world. If Republicans have a majority, I can well imagine that these people, since they now specialize in stunts and scandal and obstruction, will not approve her nominees, will not allow judges to be confirmed, will not allow legislation to go on. It's going to be trench warfare for 2 years. So we don't want that. We want a president with an agenda that is capable of being passed. And by the way, the Democrats aren't going to give her everything she wants either. And she's going to probably need to get some Republican votes. So it's not as if you're writing a blank check to Kamala Harris. You're simply removing the possibility that there might be dreadful deadlock. So if you're capable of volunteering or giving money, those 3 campaigns are absolutely key. In terms of House races, I encourage you all to go on the Cook Political Report. That has a very easy to read chart that tells you which seats are toss-ups, which are leaning in various directions. And there are 16, 17 Republican lawmakers who are in seats that Joe Biden won in 2020. Those are prime candidates for a switch. And remember, the Democrats only have to win net 5 or 6 seats, and they will have a majority. Unlike the Republicans, they can operate with a razor-thin majority because they're actually an organized party that has some semblance of discipline. You remember Nancy Pelosi didn't have any bigger a majority than Mike Johnson, but she actually got stuff done because Democrats care about governance. So look for those House seats, look for those Senate races. And one other thing. In many, many states, there is an abortion measure on the ballot. Some of them are to confirm that abortion is a constitutional right. Others are the flip side. They're there to make abortion access harder, but they are incredibly important because that's where the action now is in the Dobbs era, which is back to the states. And if you don't like what state legislatures have been doing, you don't like these Donald Trump abortion bans, then you may have a chance to set things right in your state. And if you don't have an abortion referendum in your state, look for the ones that do. Florida has one, for example. Arizona has one. Go ahead, chip in, volunteer, write postcards for those races. Not only is abortion a critical issue, but getting people to turn out for one of these abortion measures will boost Democratic turnout. And frankly, it'll boost turnout among independents who don't like a Dobbs world of dystopia in which women bleed out in the parking lot. So I would absolutely commend you to look at those ballot measures in addition to House and Senate races. But that's a great question. All right. We have, oh, this is a good one. Paula from Austin, Texas. Well, Paula, first of all, get out and vote for Colin Allred, who is the opponent of Ted Cruz. Imagine a Senate without Ted Cruz. Imagine a country without Ted Cruz. Oh, I'm excited already. Paula asks, if Kamala wins the election, what should be her first priorities? I love this. She's going to have some immediate must-dos. For one thing, the Trump tax cuts are going to expire this year. Now, that's a good thing because that gives her leverage to get things from the Republicans, whether she has a majority or not. If they do nothing, those tax cuts go away. They don't want that. They love those tax cuts. They want everyone to have tax cuts. They want more tax cuts. So with the looming deadline, she has an opportunity to start bargaining with these people. What could she do? She could say, okay, we're not going to raise the rates for anyone making less than $400,000, but we are on the super rich. Or we're going to get rid of that 20% gimmick that allows people who set up an LLC to drive their taxes down. She can do lots of things. She can raise the corporate tax. She can try to work towards equalizing the capital gains and the regular income tax. But she has some leverage to get things because Republicans need to get tax cuts. The other thing she can do is begin to work on her substantive agenda. A lot of the things that she's proposed, frankly, are tax cuts or tax credits. The child tax credit can be negotiated as part of this package. Remember, when it was in effect, it cut child poverty by 30-40%. Once it went away, the childhood poverty rate went back up again. So she can negotiate for that. She wants to do a credit for first-time home buyers. She can do it within the context of a tax bill. Now, the good thing about a tax bill is it can be done in reconciliation. What does that mean? It means if you price it out correctly, you don't need 60 votes. You can pass it with 50 plus 1. So that's a benefit. And I think you will see her try to get as much of her agenda put into a tax spending bill as is humanly possible so she can get a jump on her agenda. What else does she need to do? Well, she's going to need something on the democracy front. She's going to need something on the abortion front. We desperately need Supreme Court reform. How does she get those things? Well, let's pretend for a moment, not pretend, but hope for a moment, that Democrats get their majority, a slim majority, but a majority in the Senate. Well, they're finally going to have to do something about the filibuster, because without it, they're never going to get voting reform. They're never going to get things like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They're never going to get reform of gerrymandering. They're never going to get some basic components of democracy. Statehood for Washington, D.C. will never happen if 60 votes are required. So does she have the nerve? Do Democrats have the nerve? I think so. I think they are fed up enough with Republican obstruction that they are ready to modify, to create new exceptions, to do something that allows them to get these major pro-democracy bills through. And the third thing I think she can address fairly soon is that immigration bill. Remember, this was the one that Donald Trump sunk. This was the very tough border bill that he told Republicans, do not sign it, do not sign on to this, do not vote for this because I don't want things better. Well, she said over and over again she would sign it, so she should demand that it be put on the floor. And frankly, if Republicans try to filibuster that's a good opportunity to sink the filibuster, because then she can go to the American people and say, you guys all want border security. And these guys are so irresponsible, they don't want for a vote for something that they actually do want. So I got no choice, but the filibuster has to go overboard. So that would be a clever way of making inroads on the filibuster on something that appeals to Republicans, not just Democrats. So I think she's going to have her hands full with all of that. And along the way, if they are able to punch through and get a majority and do something about the filibuster, we need Supreme Court reform. We need a ethics bill, and we need term limits, because the notion of having these guys around for decades is frightful. So plenty to do. She's not going to get it all done. People have to be prepared to compromise, but I think there's going to be a lot of excitement and a lot of momentum if in fact she wins. All right. We get another question from Riley in Albuquerque. Riley asks, why are young men turning away from Democrats? Well, this is a very common theme in the mainstream media. In fact, men have turned away from the Democratic Party for decades now. There has been a so-called gender gap since the 1980s. So this is not some fault of Kamala Harris or the current incarnation of the Democratic Party. It's a function of the extreme ideological differences between the two parties and the fact that Democrats, frankly, address issues that many, many women care about: healthcare, education, daycare, elder care. So they have made an effort to reach out to women, to do things that affect their lives. And Republicans have devolved into this hyper-masculine, toxic, strutting kind of party that doesn't really accomplish much of anything other than to channel anger, resentment against women, against minorities, against foreigners. So it's not as if we had these men and now they've deserted. We got to do something to get them back. They've been gone for a long time. Now, does that mean that Kamala Harris can't win more men than Democrats have been doing lately? No. And in fact, I think a lot of her very muscular, very robust language on Iran, on Russia, on the border is aimed at men. It is tough. She's not indicating she's going to be a softie on much of anything. She comes out and just says, I'm a capitalist. I'm for safe borders. This sounds pretty good. In fact, someone said, and I would agree because I used to be one of them, this sounds like a moderate Republican. And in many ways, it does. So I think she is making an effort to reach not only those occasional voters we talked about earlier, the women who watch The View, the guys who listen to Howard Stern, and that's where she can pick up some male voters, but in the message that she's sending out in general, which is, I'm no softie. Trump is a mess. He's a disorganized, crazy guy. If you want stuff done, if you want protection, I'm the person to do it. And that's why she's been leaning into her career as a prosecutor and sounding as tough as she has been on issues like immigration and crime. Great question. Okay, we have Erica in Palo Alto, California. There's so much pessimism about our future. Give us some good news. Oh my. Well, that's a tall order. Let me say this about the bad news syndrome. I hate to pummel on them, but they deserve it. The mainstream media has a negative news bias. It's not a clickable story to say the economy is pretty good, everything's going pretty well. It's more clickable to say, okay, the economy may be okay, but danger is around the corner, or to predict a recession. And that's what they've done incessantly over the last 4 years. And it extends to just about everything. We were never going to rescue Ukraine. Well, we did. Biden was never going to pass any of these bills. Well, he did. So, this pessimism, this gloom and doom, this nothing's going to work attitude is reflective of the media, but not necessarily reality. And so, I think we have to separate what's real from what's kind of spin from the media. But let's come up with some things that are actually positive. And there are things that are positive. First of all, Democrats made the switch from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris seamlessly. She has been, I think, an exquisite candidate. I cannot think of one slip, one strategic error she has made, one bad outing, frankly. She has been pitch perfect. She has been diligent. She's been energetic. And you don't always get a candidate that makes as great a contrast with the opponent as you do Kamala Harris and old crazy Donald Trump. So that's one thing I think to be very optimistic about. The other is the American economy is extraordinary. Listen, I want to give credit to Biden and Harris for passing a lot of good bills. I think having an industrial policy that looks to the future is a good idea. I think allowing people to, for example, make a conversion to solar energy is good for the planet. It's good for those solar jobs. It's a good idea to have a bill that makes it easier to build chips in the United States. But beyond that, as Kamala Harris says, the economy is a function of the private sector. And we do have the most innovative, the most flexible, the most industrious economy of any country on the planet. And we prove this year after year. We have made the recovery much quicker and much stronger than was anticipated. We lead the world. Everyone talks China, China, China. Well, China is in a recession. China does not innovate. That's why they steal our intellectual property. The United States remains the engine of the world economically. And that and the preservation of that is what keeps people prosperous, what allows people to live their lives, what gives people the wherewithal to create an identity and a life that they see fit. So it is a true blessing that we have a system. It cannot be allowed to operate without regulation, that's for sure. But nevertheless, the economy is and remains a godsend. And Americans should not underestimate the ingenuity and the hard work either of workers or of entrepreneurs. What else is a good news story? Well, I think after a few elections, say 2016, 2020, 2024, a lot of people who used to vote Republican will now, after voting for Kamala Harris, have had 3 elections in which they didn't vote for a Republican. I think that's significant. I think something is going on that's beyond these candidates. It's beyond even Trump. I think there's been a fundamental shift in the electorate based on a couple things. One, on education. If you're going to be the stupid party, then people with college educations, white or non-white, are not going to want to vote for you because you're an embarrassment. And that's what Trump is, an embarrassment. The other thing is that Dobbs, I think, has absolutely sent shockwaves through the electorate. We saw it in 2022, no red wave. We have seen it in every single ballot initiative which has featured abortion. The pro-choice side has won every single one of them, even in red states. it has juiced the enrollment of women, young people, non-white voters. Those are the very groups that are going to vote Democratic. So there's that positive trend. And the last thing I would be optimistic about is if we can get through the next, 10, 20 years, I'm very optimistic about the next generation, the Generation Z and beyond. And that's because they're better educated than their parents and grandparents. They're more technologically savvy. They're more tuned into the environment. They're less obsessed with race. They are more tolerant. And there's a lot of data, frankly. I'm not just complimenting them. There's data to back this up. And they even read more than prior generations. So if we can muddle through, if we cannot blow up the democracy in the next 10 years or so, I think we're going to be okay. So I like to say in the short term, I'm very nervous. In the long term, I'm very optimistic. Okay, let's do a couple more questions. All right, we get a question from Ari in New York City. Has global opinion already priced in Israel? What's the effect of the current war? Good question. I think to some degree it is priced in. I think people who understand that Israel's enemies are our enemies, who understand that Israel is a sovereign country, we don't get to boss them around and tell them what to do, are chagrined by events there, but they understand it and are generally supportive of the administration's policy. After all, what is their policy? Their policy is to back Israel, but to work as hard as they possibly can for a ceasefire and the freeing of the hostages. That's what the protesters say they want when they're not praising Hamas, that is. That's what the average American wants. And that's the position that the administration has taken. Listen, if you're out for blood, if you want a war, if you think that Arab countries can be wiped off the map, if you think that Israel never has to address the Palestinian issue, then you probably don't like Kamala Harris to begin with. You probably were a Trumpy, and you probably think that force is the answer to everything, and that after all, perpetual war isn't in our backyard, so why don't they have it over there? So I don't think there are that many minds that are being changed by the war there. And I think the proof is, to some degree, in the polling. When you ask people what their important issues are, Israel is nowhere near the top. It's not even in single digits in some of these polls. It's the economy, it's immigration, it's abortion, climate change. All of those things rate much more acutely with the American people than does Israel. And in point of fact, and I say this regretfully because I think Ukraine should be a bigger issue, foreign policy generally does not decide presidential elections. They tend to be on so-called pocketbook issues, and they tend to be really largely reflective of the economic times that we're in. Good news, the economy is very strong. And frankly, of the personality of the people who are running. And there again, I think Democrats have something to be pleased about. All right, let's get to one last question that we have. Here we go. We have Greg from Boston. What's the best way to contribute time or money? I get this question a lot, and I'm always hesitant to kind of pick and choose what groups, what candidates, what organizations you give to. But you already know, because we've talked about it, which races are important. And if you care about those races, I would give directly to those campaigns, not to the Democratic Party, not to the DCCC, which is the Democratic Congressional fundraising arm. Give to those races, those candidates, because they really matter. But I would also make a plug for supporting the people who do the hard work of democracy. There are wonderful groups that litigate, that educate, that help make sure that our democracy does survive. You have groups like Defend Democracy, which is Mark Elias's group, Democracy Docket, where he keeps you abreast of all of the lawsuits that are going on. You have Protect Democracy. Ian Basson has been a guest on this show. They not only help litigate, but they help educate the media. They help come up with interesting proposals for reform and to enhance democracy. You can also give to groups like the NAACP, which is litigating all over the country and which is responsible for getting new seats that will be majority Black seats in Louisiana and in Alabama. And of course, there's the ACLU, which not only works in the democracy space, but works on issues like religious freedom, like discrimination, like free speech. So these are some of the groups that I think people don't necessarily think about giving to during an election season, but these guys are all working their tails off because they are getting ready for all these lawsuits. They are trying to counter the disinformation. They are trying to keep the local officials well informed so they know what their obligations are. And they sure could use your help right about now. So I would highly recommend giving to one or more of those groups. So we reached the end of our time. This was lots of fun. Thanks for all the good questions. I'm sorry I could not get to all of them. But I will end on one that I get a lot, not only from you folks, but from my readers at the Washington Post. Who is that dog that sits behind me all the time? Well, he's not here today, as you can see. If you don't see, or as I will tell you, that's Amos. He is our 5.5-year-old English setter. He is a love bug. He is very sweet and very beautiful. And he's a very good boy. As those of you who may know, he sits quietly and he doesn't like it at all when he's left out. If I close the door and he's on the other side, I will hear about it. So that's our little personal note for the day. Thank you for listening, for watching. I appreciate all of you. Please keep sending in comments, questions. I do get them. I do want to hear what you have to say. And remember, democracy depends upon you. See you next time.